So there's been a lot of different interesting points with this entire Microsoft versus the FTC when it comes to the Activision Blizzard merger and Nintendo being brought into the conversation numerous times, not only because this does directly impact Nintendo in terms of the merger, as if it does go through, we can expect Call of Duty to be on Nintendo platforms for the next 10 years. That deal is already signed and filed. It's ready to go if the merger closes. But the more interesting talking point recently really has to do with the FTC actually trying to figure out what the Nintendo Switch is. And as someone who has grown up my entire life playing on Nintendo consoles, it's pretty funny to see the FTC directly questioning things around Nintendo being any kind of a competitor to Sony or Microsoft. Now, you can clearly state that Sony versus Microsoft is a more head-to-head battle in terms of the consumers that they go after. A lot of these massive third-party games come out on Xbox and PlayStation, and then they have their one-off exclusives that make the console gamer go with one system or the other. There is more overlap with the Nintendo Switch and some of those consoles. You might find that a lot of people own a Switch in addition to a PlayStation 5 or in addition to a Xbox Series X. In fact, there was an internal Sony study that shows that in the US, nearly half of PlayStation 5 owners also have a Switch. But that's where I think that the next article we're going to read through really drives home the point that gaming competition is gaming competition, as they're fighting for all of our attention spans. And Nintendo, when they release a banger game like Tears of the Kingdom, it takes all of my attention away from the other consoles for hundreds of hours until I'm finished playing through that game, because while I own all of the consoles that we're talking about that get brought up in this entire trial, I may make decisions to buy a game on one of them and spend the majority of my time on one of them due to the type of releases that they come out with. A perfect example is Star Wars Jedi Survivor. I started that game just a little bit before Tears of the Kingdom came out, and I haven't gone back to it since because I'm waiting to finish my entire playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom before going back to it. I will go back and complete it, but there's no arguing that Nintendo didn't capture my attention with this massive release, and that's where one tidbit from this Verge article that I found very interesting kind of drives home that same point, and I would say eliminates the argument entirely that Nintendo is not a competitor to Sony and Microsoft. They are a different type of competitor, but still a competitor nonetheless. As you can see, the following breakdown where it reads, "How gamers spend their time matters. Elizabeth Bailey's PhD testimony also continued during day 4, and it was time to talk about the Nintendo Switch again. This time, Microsoft decided to argue it's about where gamers spend their time and how that affects competition for Xbox. Bailey said she had analyzed data from the 10-week Switch launch period and found a decline in the number of gamers on Xbox and PlayStation consoles and game time hours. The FTC and Microsoft argue about the Switch every day because the FTC doesn't want to count the Switch as a competitor to Xbox, but Microsoft argues it is. Bailey's analysis shows that the Switch has impacted gamer attention and where they spend their hours. If the Switch is included in the global console market, Bailey says no matter which metric we use, Xbox is the third place and has been for the last 5 years. Bailey also argues that PCs also compete with the Xbox because gamers both largely play the same top 15 games across them. Many gamers multi-own, they already have a PC. It's a large percentage, Bailey says. The FTC poked holes in Bailey's opinions before we moved on to Nvidia. So while it's funny to see the FTC and Microsoft argue in front of the judge in terms of what Nintendo is with their modern console known as the Switch, that of course has met the demand of the hybrid console market, which is just cool that you can take this thing on the go. There's even a snippet from the judge where she suggests that it might be better than a Gen 9 console because it hooks up to the TV and you can take it to the airport. A funny observation from somebody who's clearly not likely a gamer themselves, but noticed, wait, wouldn't it be better if you could play your favorite game at home on a TV screen and then you have to go to the airport and you just take that console with you? Hang on, PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X or S can't do that, right? And of course she is right with that. That's why we have an emerging mobile market that you see blowing up right now with competitors to the Switch, like the Steam Deck, like the Asus ROG Ally. There's a bunch of different ones that are popping up every day, even Logitech making cloud-based devices. Like, mobile gaming is here to stay, clearly, and Nintendo Switch was kind of just the first device that tackled that merging of the libraries where you can play your mainline AAA Nintendo games whether you're at home or on the go. But to say that it is not impacting Sony or Microsoft's business at all and it's not a competitor, I believe is the incorrect opinion to have on what the Switch is, as again, we are gamers that choose how to spend our money and which games to go buy, and Nintendo pumping out a lot of first-party exclusives that you can only play on their console hardware definitely creates some takeaway from your attention that you might be giving to a Sony PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X or S, or even the previous gen consoles, the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4. You are ultimately going to spend your money and time based off what kind of new game software you see released that you want to play, and you make that decision. There is even some back and forth around the Xbox Series S pricing and Microsoft strategically targeting that $299 price point to essentially compete with the Switch for your average gamer that might be walking into a Best Buy to pick one up locally. And you have to decide, do I want this Nintendo Switch or do I want something that is actually the same price point that maybe I can play at home with more graphical capability, and some of these Gen 9 games that are coming out third party wise or first party wise will be playable on it. They strategically entered the market at that lower price point to compete with the Switch because it is a competitor to Microsoft and their bottom line. Now, that does not mean that there can't be partnerships, because as we mentioned, if this merger does go through, I think we only see the relationship between Nintendo and Microsoft strengthen. So far, they work really well together. We've seen games like Banjo-Kazooie make it to NSO. That's a Microsoft partially owned project now, since they bought Rare and they own the assets to that game. And then the big one with a ton of red tape around it, of course, GoldenEye coming to NSO. That's another big deal, that the fact that we have that playable on Nintendo consoles today. There's even quite a bit of talk around Minecraft at this FTC hearing, where that game is generating by far and away the most revenue on the Nintendo Switch, even though it's Microsoft owned. Minecraft makes more revenue on Switch than PlayStation and Xbox, and that's a combined figure. If you combine the PlayStation and the Xbox together, it doesn't bring in as much revenue as it does on the Switch. What does something like Call of Duty mean to the Nintendo fan base if that comes over, when you might have a free-to-play Warzone on the next-gen console and people buy skins for that? They upgrade and unlock their guns, they buy all types of customizable parts and things. If these are day-and-date launches on Nintendo hardware, while you can definitely argue that maybe the hardcore first-person shooter player isn't going to spend the majority of their hours on that game on the Switch, they may still pick it up and play plenty of hours on there because of the flexibility of being able to game on the go and not rely on that cloud streaming level experience where noticeable input delay and things are hampering the overall user experience. And I also think that if this does go through, that we also see Microsoft bring over a lot of the other Activision Blizzard titles that they want to a Nintendo console, because Microsoft and Nintendo seem to have a relatively good working relationship together, and it's clearly Sony that are the guys that they don't get along with, and they would rather not be as dominant in the market as they are. And it will be interesting to see how this all wraps up. The FTC trial is now over. It is just a matter of the decision to come in the final days on whether or not this injunction is granted, and we have to see if either side appeals or not. And this will be a pivotal moment for what happens with the future of Xbox games on Nintendo Switch. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We'll definitely be covering any of the notable big updates around everything from here, but we definitely saw a lot of interesting takes over the last week of this FTC trial as it's unfolded, especially for Nintendo Switch gamers. And I want to hear from you guys at this point in the video, your personal thoughts and opinions on this entire process. What do you think about the FTC and their stance saying that Nintendo is not a competitor to the Xbox or PlayStation? Do you think that that's just clearly a disconnected view, and that these points around how gamers spend their time and on what platforms they spend their time actually does matter and it does make them a competitor? Or do you kind of see it from the FTC's viewpoint with the fact that they're not in a head-to-head battle the same way that Sony and Microsoft are, and maybe Nintendo just kind of exists on their own and doesn't really bother any of the subscriber growth on either one of those platforms? So regardless regardless of your thoughts and feelings on everything we talked about today, I do look forward to hearing from you all in the comments down below before you leave the video, as I do look forward to getting a back and forth conversation started with you all around these topics. Go watch yesterday's video next if you haven't already, which is on screen right now. Also make sure you like, subscribe, turn on your notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.